Luck is a very touchy subject when it comes to multiplayer games. People don't like losing just because of dumb luck. So when Deadlock, a MOBA game that is also a shooter, decided to give us not one, but two characters with an evasion mechanic, i.e. they have a chance to completely negate bullet damage when shot at, this is when I started to raise my eyebrows. Right now, evasion only exists on the newly released Mirage and perhaps more notoriously, Haze. Thankfully, both examples are gated behind abilities and thus have cooldowns, Mirage with his tornado and Haze with their ultimate. And the thing is, I think both of these are more or less balanced because they exist in such a limited capacity. This is not a video about me calling Haze's ult utterly stupid because I refuse to buy metal skin. Instead, this is a video about a mechanic that I fear could stem from the existence of these abilities. I believe passive evasion or evasion as a purchasable stat like bullet res or spirit res should not exist in Deadlock, and there's a lot of reasons for this. In a traditional MOBA like Dota, I could see you making the argument for an evasion mechanic existing. There is a strategy element to adding a little bit of randomness to the effectiveness of an enemy's right-click auto attacks. But in a shooter like Deadlock, evasion can feel like bad hit reg caused by lag, and you might understand how frustrating interactions like that can feel. I mean, how are you supposed to win a gunfight when half your bullets don't even register? And speaking of lag, ping spikes, high latency, packet loss, and lag in general can be massive problems if you're trying to get good at a fast-paced shooter like Deadlock. That's why I use GearUP Booster to optimize my Deadlock experience and to ensure that when I die, it's not because of lag, but due to my teammates' incompetence or because the enemy was hacking. What GearUP does is that it automatically detects the best subserver for you and ensures that you're getting a stable connection when you play the game. That's why GearUP gives me better ping and less lag spikes on average during my Deadlock sessions. Now, there are a lot of factors that go into the stability of your connection, including your geographical location and your internet speed, but GearUP will ensure that you'll experience as little lag as possible for your system. And I wouldn't be talking about a product that doesn't work for me. GearUP helped me go from 29 to 30 ping down to a stable 19 without any ping spikes. If you want to give GearUP a shot, check out the links in the pinned comment and description for a free trial. With Deadlock still being an alpha, they might not have as many servers, and if you live far away from one, you could experience network issues that ruin your gaming sessions and lower your ever so valuable KDA. So equip yourself with a GearUP gaming booster to tackle high latency, packet loss, and cross-region play issues. Check out the links in the description and enjoy a seamless, optimized gaming experience. Let me know if you can beat my ping of 19 after trying GearUP Booster, and thanks to GearUP for sponsoring this video. Now, to understand why I'm afraid IceFrog and Valve might add passive evasion to this game, we need to look at where the evasion mechanic came from and its role in Dota, Deadlock's predecessor. So, of course, Dota's gameplay, and with it every traditional MOBA that followed, is based on Warcraft's. It has a top-down perspective, click-to-control setup, and all that jazz. To make your character attack another character in Dota, you simply right-click them and they will perform an attack, ranged or melee, depending on who they are. There's no aim check, and the game always assumes perfect accuracy when attacking, unless you're a ranged unit attacking uphill. See, a mechanic in Dota that actually got its roots from Warcraft 3 is the uphill miss. In both games, when you're a ranged unit from low ground attacking another target on high ground, you have a 25% chance of missing entirely. This is a form of passive evasion in Dota, and one that everyone has access to from minute zero. Gameplay wise, this was probably implemented and kept to balance the dichotomy between ranged units and melee units in both games, while also making the lives of Dota's mid laners much more miserable. And thematically, it makes sense. In military tactics, fighting someone uphill as a guy with a bow means you have to be more thoughtful of your projectile trajectory, as you have to account for gravity, and you might even be forced to look at the direction of the sun, effectively giving you a partial blind. I mean, high ground advantage is literally written right there in the Art of War. And while this doesn't really apply too much today because of advancements in technology granting access to things like drone strikes, we're talking about Warcraft and Dota, which are games set in fantasy worlds in ye olden times. And passive evasion is in itself a Warcraft mechanic, with certain units having evasion in their kits and having it be an acquirable stat just like in Dota. And speaking of, there are heroes with evasion built into their kits, like Phantom Assassin and the much less talked about Brewmaster, as well as passive evasion being purchasable as a stat to the Talisman and its upgrades in Butterfly in Heaven's Halberd. And the reason why the mechanic is balanced is because of the nature of Dota and the fact that the game gives you the tools to deal with it. See, Dota is a game where almost every unit can auto-attack, but that doesn't mean that everybody should. Because of the game's more strategic nature, a lot of supports actually contribute more value by staying in the fog of war and keeping themselves hidden from the enemy. Thus, it's a game where some characters are meant to attack more than others. Passive evasion is a stat particularly more valuable against other carries than supports. This isn't isn't just because carries right-click more than supports, but because having passive evasion, whether it be through an innate item or ability, forces the enemy to respond by building anti-evasion items like those from the Javelin tree, namely Monkey King Bar. But there's also items like Bloodthorn, which debuffs an enemy and completely removes their evasion checks, and Silver Edge, which can disable passive abilities like Phantom Assassin's evasion for a short time. To add to this, the nature of evasion in Dota isn't truly random. That's because Dota's evasion mechanics use pseudo-random distribution, which means the actual dodge chance for evasion starts out smaller than advertised, but escalates with every time it doesn't proc, resets when it does proc, which averages out to the dodge chance given. This makes it such that your odds of missing like 5 attacks in a row in Dota is incredibly low and unlikely to happen to you. It's like how crit chance works in League of Legends. To illustrate why passive evasion is fine in Dota, it's because the game isn't designed with every member of the team constantly auto-attacking to deliver value. The game gives you all the tools you need to deal with it, and the game is designed to ensure that the typical right-clicker doesn't get too unlucky. But IceFrog and Valve cannot take these fixes and slap them onto Deadlock and expect it to work the same way it did in Dota. And let me explain why. First of all, shooters are fundamentally different from top-down strategy games because of the introduction of aiming mechanics. In a shooter, whether or not your attacks hit your targets should come down to your mechanical skill in terms of aim. When you're on the ground and have the gun in your hands, you're rewarded for having good aim by damaging and potentially killing the other guy. This is actually the very essence of shooter games. When you shoot someone that you're aiming at, it should register and reward you for that interaction. The introduction of passive evasion would break this fundamental rule. If an enemy can ignore your damage despite you taking the time to adjust your crosshair, account for recoil, and ensure that your shots are on target, it nullifies the aspect of having good aim. So at that point, why even bother going through all the trouble to make all your shots on target when a portion of them won't be counted anyway? And this only adds to the fact that passive evasion is kind of already in the game. And this is actually a point given in the comments from a community poll I did asking my viewers if Deadlock should have evasion mechanics, to which 55% of people said no. Gunfights in Deadlock are a lot more interactive than 1v1s in Dota. In the latter, you can use your abilities, items, and environment to your advantage, but it ultimately comes down to a stat check. However, in a 1v1 duel in the former, because aim is a factor, and assuming no cheats are involved, you can do a lot more things to win a fight that you simply cannot do in Dota. You can strafe to mess with the opponent's aim, and if that's not enough, you can dash jump, wall jump, slide, and do all kinds of movement abilities to potentially cause your enemy to miss and expend their ammo. This forces them to reload and in turn makes them a lot more vulnerable. This also doesn't take into account the fact that characters in Deadlock have different hitboxes. You're going to have a lot harder of a time shooting a Vindicta or Haze when they're strafing side to side versus, say, Mo and Krill. Thus, the evasion stat does already passively exist in the form of hitbox sizes and movement speed, negating the need for a standalone stat. By keeping passive evasion out of Deadlock, you ensure that gunfights are interactive and skill-based. And while stats do play a role in deciding the outcome of a gunfight, it shouldn't be the be-all end-all like it is in Dota. Especially when you consider that when you introduce evasion as a standalone stat, you're going to need a way to counter it, and this is how things are kept in balance. Dota, as mentioned, has items that negate passive evasion checks, but the only purpose for these items to exist is because evasion is in the game. And of course, I'm talking about Monkey King Bar. And that's a whole can of worms that we're about to get into. It's why Riot simply didn't want evasion in League. They actually had evasion mechanics in the first season, but removed it because it was simply too hard to balance because its introduction would necessitate an entirely separate mechanic to counter evasion. And while you could make the argument that it's the same as buying Ethereal Shift to counter something like Wraith Ult, it really isn't. See, all the counter items in Deadlock have multiple uses, despite being situational. Anti-heal items like Toxic Bullets and Healbane don't just counter heroes like Ivy and Abrams by reducing the amount they heal. They also have added effects like Toxic Bullets, applying a bleed, and Healbane giving a heal on kill. While you could buy these items to counter the kits of specific heroes, they counter all kinds of healing, including lifesteal and passive regen, thus they are useful in multiple situations. You can make the same case for Ethereal Shift and Metal Skin. Sure, they help you survive against Wraith and Haze ults respectively, but both are generally good items and are helpful in situations other than countering these powerful ultimates. However, once you introduce passive evasion and with it an evasion countering item, the game will devolve into an item check. That's to say that if you want to counter evasion, you'll be forced to dedicate one of your item slots to countering the character. And this isn't the same as, say, buying Curse or Silence against the Yamato to prevent her from ulting. Those items are useful in and of themselves and can be used on anyone on the enemy team. However, when you devote an entire item slot to countering another item, no, a single line of text, this limits your build flexibility and agency as a player. It would be the same problem with MKB and Dota in terms of item design. This item's main purpose in most games is specifically to counter evasion. Sure, IceFrog has changed it enough to the point where it's viable in very niche situations on specific heroes, but for most auto-attacking carries, it's relegated to just being an answer to evasion and goes untouched in games where the gimmick is a non-factor. This is because compared to other damage options, it is considered subpar in most cases, even with the stats and beneficial effects. That's why my suggestion to counter evasion mechanics, because you just know that eventually there will be more characters with a mechanic introduced down the line, would be not to link it to an item, but rather to player skill. Specifically, making headshots bypass evasion checks. This gives you clear counterplay against characters with evasion abilities, but it's not too easy to achieve such that it nullifies their existence. It also escapes the pitfall of Dota's evasion mechanic, which is evasion being powerful until an enemy builds a specific item, and then it just becomes a non-factor when facing that specific hero. And while you could make the argument that this would butcher evasion characters in higher skill lobbies, I would also say that it's fair to reward players for good aim by allowing them to bypass what boils down to a luck check. And passive evasion doesn't only limit item design, but also the viability of certain character archetypes. In the same poll as above, another user stated that passive evasion is just another form of damage reduction, but that's simply not true. While sure, theoretically, if you shoot 2 targets for 100 times each, and one target has 20% evasion while the other has 20% bullet resist, they should both take about 80% of the damage they would have before resistances. But this is in a vacuum and doesn't paint the full picture. What if hypothetically there was a character like Jhin from League of Legends in Deadlock? And if you're unfamiliar with his overall concept, he's a right-click damage character that can only attack 4 times every few seconds, but each of those 4 shots does a ton of damage, with the 4th shot dealing even more damage. Despite his fixed attack speed, his high damage per bullet is what allows him to reach similar levels of DPS to faster attackers like Jinx. His introduction to League of Legends broke the mold of what a League ADC should be, negating the need for attack speed. In fact, he's such a beloved character that he's frequently touted as a masterclass in champion design from Riot, and deservedly so. However, evasion mechanics inherently favor fast attackers over slower ones. That's because if you get unlucky and miss a shot, or god forbid, 2 shots in a row as a slower attacking character, your DPS plummets while faster attackers can simply keep shooting. This is partly the reason why Dota has such a massive emphasis on attack speed, and why even carries that are designed to have lower attack speeds are commonly built with items that will make them hit faster instead of harder. And it's why I believe a character like Jhin can only work in League where passive evasion doesn't exist. Heavy hitting, slow firing characters deserve a place in Deadlock just as much as fast firing bullet hoses do. Passive evasion would disproportionately screw over the former by design, making them unviable without specific checks. To wrap things up, I think that the way IceFrog has implemented evasion currently in Deadlock, in tying into cooldowns and abilities, is fine. At least for now. Active evasion, or having the mechanic tied to an ability, fits in the game the same way something like Viscus's Cube does. It's not overly oppressive and tied to a character thematically. But for the reasons stated above, I firmly believe that passive evasion is a mechanic that does not belong in Deadlock, and I hope that IceFrog feels the same way. But I could be wrong. If you want to share your thoughts, let me know in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more Deadlock content from a design perspective. Catch you in the next one, and ace out.